First of all, I want to say good evening and happy July 4th. I'm wearing my Stars and Stripes. I also want to tell you that tomorrow on Sunday morning, there's going to be a very special choir presentation, and you'll want to make sure that you watch that. And I think you're really going to enjoy it. It was kind of a unique experience, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So don't miss tomorrow's service, and be sure that you get there. Be sure that you're there for the singing part of the service too, because I think you're really going to like it. The other thing I want to tell you is that the coronavirus has hit our household, and we got to go spend the time with the kids, and you saw the video from last week, and I made that on Saturday evening or Saturday afternoon. And on Sunday morning, a lady came to the kids' house to take baby pictures, and she came and she did not wear a mask. And on Sunday, after she had been there that day, she texted my daughter-in-law to say that she was running a fever. And so the next day she went and got tested, and come to find out, not only did she test positive, but her daughter who came with her also tested positive. And Bruce and I had gone downstairs to get away to just get away from all the hubbub of what was going to be happening there with pictures for all of them and everything. And we went down to listen to church service, and so we really were not exposed to it. But Bruce called me on Thursday afternoon and said he was running a fever. And right after I left there, Aaron took me to the airport. And when Aaron got home and I landed in Dallas, Lindsay said that Aaron was running a fever. And so I got home Thursday night. And yesterday, Bruce and I both ended up to go to be tested. No results have come back. And the kids went tested. But they all have symptoms of it so far. Bruce is feeling much better. He's had a headache. He had just some fever and a little tightness in his chest, but he's feeling better. And I haven't really felt any symptoms that I recognize as the ones that say that you have it. So I'm sure that it will come across to me too, because we've all been into such close of an environment. But that was just really frustrating that the lady came and she didn't consider to protect us from her, or the possibility that she could even have it. So anyway, it is what it is, and we're all safe. But I just wanted to let y'all know that we're fine, we're safe, and at this point, nobody seems to be too bad. I got in a swim yesterday and a walk last night and a 19-mile bike ride this morning, so seems to be okay for right now, but I know that it hits pretty fast. And so anyway, be that as it may, it's going to be hard to avoid it, and you don't even know where it is. So anyway, today we are in Proverbs 5, and we're not going to have to cover all the verses of it. The Sunday school lesson covers about the first 11 verses, and then it jumps and covers a few at 15 through 18, so it's kind of limited on it. But I want to get you ready, so make sure you get your Bible ready, and you're ready to study the Word of God. So let's pray. God, I just thank you for your love for us and how much you take care of us and you protect us. And we continue to pray for safety, and Lord, for the people that have now succumbed to the virus. God, we see that there are times that we don't even know that it's there, and Lord, the most thing we can do is just to do what you asked us to do, what the government asked us to do, and that's put on our masks and try to stay away from people and as much as we possibly can. And I just thank you for your care for us and your constant wisdom and guidance, and I pray that you'll continue to keep your hand in control of everything, and Lord, that you continue to let it sift through your fingers of the things that you can do to protect us. God, I ask you to just bless the reading of this word today, and may we all learn something from your word today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, they're on your notes, and I hope I remember to get it all in the email. You see, we are in Proverbs 5, and it's verses 1 through 18. And the Sunday school lesson said following God's design, and our God's design in this lesson is for sexual purity that Solomon gives as words of wisdom to quote his son. One of the comments in the Sunday school said something about when we are having construction and building something, we expect the builders or whoever's involved to follow the blueprints and follow the plans of what was supposed to be done. Failure to do so leads to some problems down the road. And we know that things that are shoddily built are not going to stand. And even in Matthew, God warns us from building on rocky and shifting sand. I remember years ago when Hurricane Alicia hit. We lived in the Sagemont area, and we had not been married but about a year. And there were some new little houses that were built right off of Scarsdale and Beamer. And after the hurricane hit, we drove down, and there was one house that was under construction, and it was a 2-story house that was being built. And the storm actually knocked down the upper level of the house as it was being built. It was just a tumble of sticks that looked like a pile of toothpicks. And like 2 days later, it was all put back together again. And I always wondered about the structure that was built there and how strong it would possibly be that it was all put back so quickly. And so, that's one of the things that we think of is that when things are being built, they need to be built with a strong foundation, and they need to be built with sturdiness and has the plan. They follow the plan. And so that's what the introduction to our lesson said. And if a structure's not built to code, you can't even inhabit it. When our younger son was going to be in 8th grade, they built new Space Center Intermediate over off of on NASA property, and there were the first 2 days of school, the kids in the junior high didn't even get to go to school because there were some permits that hadn't been approved, and so there was some code issues on some things and so they couldn't even use the building. And so that's another thing that's really important about stuff, following the rules and following the things that need to be done. So God has a clear design for intimacy in the confines of marriage, and Solomon addresses the traps that those who ignore God's design might encounter. They would miss the blessings that God would have waiting for them, those people that follow his plan. In the first house that we owned was real interesting. After a while, we decided to order some mini blinds instead of old curtains, and we measured all the windows and got the dimensions of what we needed, and we ordered the blinds, and the blinds came, and Bruce installed the blinds in a little front window by the front door, and he put the blinds in, and I looked at the blinds and I asked him, I said, why did you hang them crooked? Well, it turns out that Bruce did a perfect job. He did it exactly what it was supposed to be, but the problem was the blueprint called for, they were supposed to install a window into a frame that had squared up corners, and there were 90-degree corners in it. Well, evidently, somebody didn't measure correctly, and they weren't squared up corners. And so fortunately, what we ended up doing was adjusting the way the blind actually hung. So the blind was actually hanging crooked, but hanging in a crooked window, it made it look straight. And so sadly, we were able to make it look right when it wasn't. But things that are done outside of God's plan can't be adjusted to fit quite so easily. You can cover up a mistake, but the emotional scars will remain, and there will probably be some financial problems, among other issues that happen when we make those mistakes that involve the sexual sin in our lives. God warned his children not to get involved with peoples of other nations because they would be lured away from worshiping him. And this is the same pattern for our marriage, is that we have to avoid the pitfalls and we have to avoid all the lures that Satan puts in front of us to try and destroy our marriages, because it's a pattern for our relationship with God. Deuteronomy 7:3-4 says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly be destroyed. In Exodus 34:15-16, it says, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for they will prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, and they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same thing. It says make a treaty, but you know, a covenant is the same way, and our marriages are supposed to be covenants. And so that's one thing that we're going to find out later that Solomon wasn't able to do. Genesis 24:37-38, it says, and my master made me swear an oath, and it said, you must not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live, but go to my father's family and to my own clan and get a wife for my son. So stay within the bounds of things. There's a boundary for us. In Joshua 23:12-13, it said, but if you turn away and ally yourself with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your back and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord has given you. And even with all of the wisdom that Solomon had, he did not heed God's warning. And as we read here, we're going to find out that when he got a little bit older, some things happened. So that's never an excuse, is to be old and to blame it on being old. So open your Bibles, if you would, start out in 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings 11, we're going to read the first 13 verses. So 1 Kings chapter 11, I'm reading from my New Living one because the print's big enough for me to see. First of all, I'm going to say this. I'm going to go back in Deuteronomy 17, verse 17, and read a verse to you. It says, the king, these are, in Deuteronomy, these were the special rules for how a king should act and the leaders of the nation. It says, the king must not take many wives for himself, because they will lead him away from the Lord, and he must not accumulate vast amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. Now, we're going to see what happens. In chapter 11 of 1 Kings, it says, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sodom, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed his people not to intermarry with those nations because the women they married would lead them to worship their gods. Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and sure enough, they led his heart away from the Lord. In Solomon's old age, remember, old age is no excuse. They turned his heart to worship their gods instead of trusting only in the Lord his God, as his father David had done. Solomon worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Now, an Ashtaroth was, they had a pole that they set up to worship, and there were sexual acts involved there. In Molech was so evil that they were even sacrificing their children to Molech. Thus Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely, as his father David had done. On the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, he even built a shrine for Shemah, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And Solomon built such shrine for all his foreign wives to use for burning incense and sacrificing their gods. The Lord was very angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had warned Solomon specifically about worshiping other gods, but Solomon would not listen to the Lord's command. So now the Lord said to him, "Since you have not kept my covenant and have disobeyed my laws, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do this while you are still alive. I will take the kingdom away from your son, and even so I will take the kingdom away from your son, and even so I will let him be king for one tribe, for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, my chosen city." So we see what Solomon's sin brought upon the nations. We see, first of all, that where did he go wrong? Well, he went wrong by disobeying what the responsibilities of a king was. And his decisions led to the split of the kingdom because David's was only going to control the tribe of Judah, was only going to be one tribe, and all the rest of the nations would be the nation of Israel. And we're going to see that it split the kingdom, and it also ended the peace, because during Solomon's time there was peace and prosperity for all the people, not just for being a king, but the whole nation itself. And they lost that. But despite what Solomon did, and that he displeased God, and the verses of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, the things that he wrote are God's word. They're still God's word. We can see through his life, how God uses imperfect people to accomplish great things, because Solomon built the temple, which was where God was able to come and inhabit and be with his people. And so we can see the failures in their lives, but gosh, how much do we fail Jesus? How much do we fail God? How much do we not seek to look like Jesus? And so that's where we are. So let's move on and turn to Proverbs chapter 5. In today's verses, I wrote there on your notes, Solomon urges his son to pay attention to his warning about sexual immorality. He focuses on adultery, but the passage covers a wide range of sexual sins that tempt believers to ignore God's design and to make foolish choices. The verses say, "my son," but it's very much directed at daughters too, because in these days, nowadays, it takes two. It's not just the results of what a boy might choose to do, but there's decisions that a girl has to make involving two. And I wrote, this is from one of the commentaries, in today's generation there is much that needs to be voiced to both sons and daughters concerning their behavior and the choices concerning sexual purity. I can only speak about advice that you would give to boys because I had boys. I do have 2 granddaughters now, and I hope that there will be some words of wisdom that I would be able to share with them in the years to come. Solomon in this reading is again where he personifies something in with respect to a woman. So he personifies immorality as a woman who lures men, and we also need to think about how to address that immorality that attracts a girl, that would take a girl into a promiscuous lifestyle too. So as we read this, those of you that have daughters, those of you that have granddaughters, we need to think about where are they in this position of being written to here? So, in verses 1 and 2, open your books to Proverbs 5, and we'll read the verses for that. Verses 1 and 2, it says, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen carefully to my wise counsel. Then you will learn to be discreet and will store up knowledge." So there he tells us to listen to wise counsel. And it says, learn to be discreet. So maintain discretion. Now, discretion is the skill of making right decisions. Good thinking, he says, discreet and will store up knowledge. Good thinking is learned from the wisdom that you have to base your thinking on. So if you don't have any wisdom, then you don't have anything to base what your thoughts are on. You just have all kinds of random thoughts. Sometimes my little granddaughter this last week would she's a real planner, and she wants to talk about what her agenda is for the next day. And sometimes her thoughts are so strangely random. That's being 5 years old. But, we have people that don't have good thinking skills because they don't have anything to base their thoughts on. So that's important. James 1:5 says, "If you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, that it will be given to him." And in James 3:17 it says, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure." So here's a great verse. That's a powerful verse to go along with Proverbs 5. So now let's look on down at verses 3 through 6. It says, "The lips of an immoral woman are as sweet as honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But the result is as bitter as poison, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps lead straight to the grave. For she does not care about the path of life. She staggers down a crooked trail and doesn't even realize where it leads." So on your notes there, I wrote, the lure of immorality, it's so strong. It's so subtle. Just little ways that it comes in. While I was at Aaron and Lindsay's, Lindsay and I watched a documentary on Netflix one night called Athlete A. It was about the gymnastics scandal that came about in 2016, and how Larry Nassar, who was a, quote, team doctor for over 20 years, how he was able to abuse so many young gymnasts and athletes. And one of the girls in the video described him was that while their coaches were taskmasters, he was real nice to them. So here's what it said. It said, the lips of the woman are sweet and sweet as honey. So the words, the things that the immoral woman says, and that her mouth is smoother than oil, that the things that comes out of her mouth seem like they're really kind and real sweet, but they're not. And this man was, while their coaches were mean, this man came to him and he seemed to be very nice, and he seemed to be very kind to him. And the girl said that he would bring them candy and snacks and food and things that their diet had prohibited, and so they thought he was nice to them, and they just dismissed a lot of the things that he did. But in looking at the pedophile category and the profile for a pedophile, he fit that. And these girls just didn't know how to manage it, and to what was happening to him, that this man was supposed to be real nice. And so that's what Solomon's warning about here. The reality of immorality is a bitter poison. It seems like it's really good, but it's not. Have you ever tasted the vanilla extract? It smells so good. It just smells so good. But if you taste it, it's bitter. Same thing with cinnamon. Cinnamon has a great smell. It's so enticing, and especially if it's baking. But if you just take a spoonful of cinnamon, it's awful. And that's what immorality is describing here. There's no respect for the person, and it can often lead to death. It says, the person, for she does not care about the path to life. She does have no respect for people. And it might not be a physical death, but it may be so damaging to emotional health that it can cause problems for the future, just for any relationships that you might have. In Proverbs 14:12, I left you a verse there. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it is a way to death. So let's look on it, verses 7 through 11. So now, my sons and daughters and children, listen to me. Never stray from what I'm about to say. Run from her. Don't go near the door of her house. If you do, you will lose your honor and hand over to merciless people everything you have achieved in life. Strangers will obtain your wealth, and someone else will enjoy the fruit of your labor. Afterwards, you will groan in anguish when disease consumes your body. So, what's he saying here? Well, first of all, think about the long term. Before you make a quick decision, think about a long term. Now, that's easy for me as a 66-year-old woman to say, but when I was 20, I didn't do that either. We didn't think about the long term of something because our lives were so short at that time. I remember thinking back in the 1990s, how old would I be when the 2000 comes around? Well, 2000 is a long way in the rear view mirror at this time. So we need to think long term before we make some actions. He said, listen. So in here, he said, listen, my son, but you know what? That isn't just my son. That's all believers. That's everybody. That's all of us. We need to listen and not reject the godly advice that we're given. And keep in mind that sons in this case is a real broad category. I don't even think it's for people who are non-believers. I mean, non-believers still need to listen. They need to be able to make good decisions. You can still be not a Christian, but have to make good decisions. I mean, that's important. And in thinking about this, I have two very close friends that are sisters for me that I don't have. I didn't have a sister, so they're as close to sisters for me. And I think it's very important that we have a friend that we can be accountable to. And that, because yes, you have your spouse, but that friend can say things to you that your spouse can't say to you. And that friend can tell you some things about something they notice about you that your spouse wouldn't say to you. And so I think it's really important that in our time frame of listening to what God has to say is that we have a friend that's accountable, that we have to be held accountable to as well. And I think that's really important too. The second part in this one, it says the best way not to give in to the lure of immorality is to avoid even the slightest possibility of coming in contact with it. We live in a world that is so wide open. There are no filters just about anywhere that you look. We are so exposed to exposed bodies wherever we are. And the sexual behaviors that we cross paths with on TV, social media, what kids write and things that people post on social media. I have a Twitter feed, but I don't hardly ever write anything on it. But I do have friends that do, and so I have those. And I have gotten some Twitter feeds off of some of the high school kids that I've worked with. Some of them that are athletes, and some of those kids post some things that I have to finally just delete because that they just don't understand how wrong that is to put that out there. Hollywood, what Hollywood creates. Not only does Hollywood create visions and pictures that we see, but they create visions that we think we should live up to. And I think that's an area where young girls struggle, where their immorality is maybe in a position that I want to be loved and I want to be attractive and I want to be attractive to someone. I think for me, some of the most disgusting things I've seen on TV are some of the shows of The Bachelorette and The Bachelor, and where young women are thinking that they are supposed to be able to be these objects in a man's life, and where that sets in for young women to want that desire to be that way. So we just have to be really careful about the things that we allow ourselves to be exposed to. That's just one of those. And the next point is he said, run from her, don't go near her. Steer your eyes, your desires, your ears, your wants, and your wishes in the direction that God would approve of. I wrote down there 1 Thessalonians 5:22 and 20 to 22. Don't scoff at prophecies. Again, here is, don't discount what I'm saying, but test everything that is said. Hold on to what is good and stay away from every kind of evil. Solomon talks about here, what are the consequences for not doing this? Your failure to do so will result in being vulnerable to being drained of your reputation and your honor. Things that you've worked so hard for to try and do. He said, you will lose your honor and hand it over to merciless people, everything you have achieved in life. So there also I wrote, merciless people prey on those people who make foolish choices. Think about scam artists. Boy, they are looking for easy targets. And they're just roaming like a roaring lion, seeking to who they can find as an easy target. And the last part on these verses is that physical and mental destruction will result. You know, you look at people who have had a hard life. That's the best way to describe it. Just a really hard life, and what the physical toll is on their body. It's just a physical life. Even, you know, if we see pictures of our political, especially our president, what they look like when they took office, and the wear and tear physically on, you can see it in their faces at the end of 8 years of an office, as President Bush was. Obama, he was gray-headed. I mean, things changed in those years. It's hard life, what it does hurt you physically. And the last verses in our lesson today were targeted at verses 15 through 18. So if you would skip down just a little bit, we stopped at verse 11. Jump on over to verse 15. I wrote there in your notes, the health and survival of the marriage relationship depends on being faithful to one another. And here Solomon writes, drink water from your own well. Share your love only with your wife or your husband. Why spill the water of your springs in public, having sex with just anyone? You should reserve it for yourselves. Don't share it with strangers. Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. So this is strictly to married people that he wrote right here. Don't abandon what you've worked so hard for. In Solomon's day and the location where they were, water was a precious treasure. So he used an example here of it. Don't drink water from your own well. In some translations it says from your cistern. Drink from your own cistern. And a cistern was a receptacle that they had for receiving and storing water. It might have been a big hole that they had to dig, but they had to work to do it. And Solomon said, you know, don't abandon that. Don't drink from your own well. You didn't need to leave what you've got and move on somewhere else to think it's going to be any better. Devotion in marriage is critical for a lasting relationship, especially when the nest becomes empty. Did you ever have to reintroduce yourself to your mate? I know because when you're raising children, your life is centered around your kids, and that's what you talk about. And you have to kind of introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Martha. I married you so many years ago. So yeah, that's really special. The second note I made there is God's design for marriage is for fidelity. Solomon questions why would you spill the water of your springs in public, having sex with just anyone? Um, that's really a disturbing trend nowadays with kids. That there's no understanding of how important a clean sexual relationship or a clean blackboard would be for your marriage to have not had sex before you get married. They don't understand that. They think it's just a physical act and that it's not going to have anything to do with you, but it does affect you emotionally. And so that's what Solomon's talking about here. God's commandment about adultery is perfectly clear, and Jesus settled any but ifs. But what if anyone should ever wonder about? In Exodus 20:14 is one of our 10 commandments. You must not commit adultery. And in Matthew 5:28, Jesus said, "But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's a really strong verse, and that's where we have to be very careful about letting our eyes wander, letting our desires wander, being lonely, being those kinds of things happening with us. So we have to be so careful. On your notes I wrote, both husband and wife must not let strangers entice them into sin. Blessings will abound when a marriage is on solid ground with faithfulness and commitment to each other. And then as a result, couples can enjoy the pleasure of the design God has for marriage by loving each other and serving God together. We have a responsibility to younger generations to show how marriage should work. And there's a lot of years of marriage in our Sunday school class, and a lot of years of commitment. And every one of us can say it is not easy. It is not easy, and it's not perfect, and it's not all sugar plums and roses, because there's some unkind words said among married couples, and there's some things that are done that are not kind, but there's a commitment that says, we're in this together. And so let us, when we have stayed in it, and I know Bruce and I have an anniversary coming up next month, and it's not nearly as long as what some of you guys have had, but sometimes we're real quick to just dismiss and say, well, it's our anniversary, but we really should not dismiss our anniversaries, because there's many times right now in our lives that people don't understand or don't even have a commitment to have an anniversary of marriage. So my comment is, don't let us be too quick to dismiss our anniversaries. That's still time for celebration. And I close with the verses there on your list, on your lesson. Psalm 71:18. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation. And that's our responsibility. Your mighty acts. I'm going to declare your power and your mighty acts to all who are to come. And to remain committed in your marriage really takes some mighty acts. Thanks, guys, for listening, and I hope you enjoy church tomorrow on Sunday morning, and celebrate as we celebrate some patriotic time in our church service. And we miss not being able to do the 4th of July program that we do every year. I know that's something that's just a lot of fun for us as a choir to do. But thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And let's pray. God, I just love you and I thank you. Bless this time, Lord, and just pray that you continue to keep a hedge of protection around our sweet group. I love you and praise you in Jesus' name.